Your Royal Highness, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Speaker, Ministers, Excellencies, Mr. County Governor, colleagues and students, ladies and gentlemen. Never look down to test the ground before taking your next step. Only he who keeps his eyes fixed on the far horizon will find his right road. In this quote, Dag Hammarskjöld uses the metaphor of the horizon to visualize the importance of perspectives, and the metaphor of the road of the journey to refer to life. These are familiar images. We see our lives as a story of continuous struggle and progress. To Dag Hammarskjöld, this seems to have been a vivid vision. His book, Markings, suggests this to be true. And so do many of the notes that he have left for us to consider and to be inspired by. Less than a month ago, looking ahead to today's event, which Uppsala University is delighted to arrange together with the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, I visited Backåkra in Skåne. Well, the accent came through there, I could tell. Sorry. The farm bought by Hammarskjöld in 1957 was intended as a summer residence. It has now been renovated and will be used as a meeting place for research and activities focused on the interest of the former United Nations Secretary General. I believe it would appeal to Dag Hammarskjöld and his vision of diplomacy. Lately, Backåkra's name was brought to wider public attention by the announcement that the United Nations Security Council was to meet there. As I'm sure you yourself experienced, Mr. Secretary General, that Backåkra is a perfect place to rest one's journey, and the beautiful view from the property across the sea makes it easy to keep one's gaze on the horizon. Meeting places like Backåkra are important. When we get away from our everyday struggles for a moment and look at the big picture, we can sometimes take a step back and see that our perspective is often limited. That we are, in fact, staring at our feet, exactly what Hammarskjöld warned us not to do. Never look down to test the ground before taking your next step. Dag Hammarskjöld himself certainly followed his own advice. He was constantly traveling, seeking to get and stay on speaking terms with the leaders and other key figures who had the power to obtain or maintain peace in the world at that time. Hammarskjöld used the term preventive diplomacy to describe his method. His goal was to prevent conflicts from growing out of proportion. We must bear in mind that Dag Hammarskjöld was the Secretary General during the Cold War and that the situation was both hostile and fragile. As you know, the last effort of his life regarding the conflict in Congo was a delicate mission to keep the country united with the help of the UN troops while keeping foreign powers out of the country that was struggling to make a new start after decolonization. At Uppsala University, we have a strong and special relationship with Dag Hammarskjöld, who grew up here and is one of the university's greatest alumni. In him, we see an example. In his work, we find inspiration. We believe we can make a difference through our students and our strong engagement in challenges currently facing the humankind and our world. In Dag Hammarskjöld's words, we keep our eyes fixed on the far horizon. In this spirit, we are happy to host this occasion, to welcome all of you to Uppsala Castle, and of course, to bid a particularly warm welcome to our guest of honor, the Secretary General, António Guterres. And now, I would like to give the floor to Professor Peter Wallensten, who will say a few words to introduce the Secretary General. Thank you and welcome.
Your Royal Highness, Your Excellency, Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Speaker of the Parliament, Ministers, Excellencies, Mr. County Governor, Vice Chancellor, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. Sir, let me just to reiterate this warm welcome to you to come to Uppsala University. I need to point out it's the oldest university of Scandinavia, as you were recently at the southernmost university. I'm at the Department for Peace and Conflict Research, a professor dealing with some of those issues that are your daily work. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to the audience, Mr. António Guterres, the Dag Hammarskjöld Speaker of 2018, the 9th Secretary General of the United Nations. The Secretary General has a degree in engineering from Instituto Superior Técnico in Lisbon, the leading technical university in Portugal. After the return of democracy in 1974, he was elected to the parliament on a social democratic platform, becoming prime minister in 1995 and staying in that position for 7 years. The East Timor crisis was one of his major international concerns. East Timor, a former Portuguese colony which had been occupied by Indonesia. The solution that was worked out in 1999 was in line with the desires of the local population, no doubt. Mr. Guterres has a considerable experience in dealing with international affairs, not only from this, but also he was elected to hold the office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees 2005-2015. And this was a period with rising numbers of conflicts, refugees and displaced people in the world. In October 2016, Mr. Guterres was appointed by the General Assembly to his present position as Secretary General through an unusually open selection process for the Secretary General, a good example for the UN to follow. When appointed, you, sir, made strong references to gender equality, calling the empowerment of women and girls a priority commitment. You also said the dream of the founders remained to be achieved. Now, 16 months into your office, have we come closer to the realization of this dream? Maybe you will enlighten us on that. So after your presentation, there will be some time for questions, and I will give priority to some students in the audience, and that's the way we will proceed. So let me now, Your Excellency, the Secretary General of the United Nations, the floor is yours. Please welcome.
Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it is for me an enormous pleasure and an enormous honor to be here today in this old university and one of the founders of the European spirit, and at the same time to pay tribute to a man that I consider to be my reference and my inspiration in the work I try to do as Secretary General of the United Nations. If I ask anywhere in the world, who's the personality that better represents the UN, I have no doubt that the answer will be unanimously Dag Hammarskjöld. And indeed, what he has done, the values he fought for, and this supreme sacrifice of his life in the line of duty for the UN and for its values, make him the central reference of the United Nations and make him, as I said, a fundamental inspiration for us all that want to pursue the same goals, the same objectives, with reference to the same values. And I have to say that the element that is, for me, more inspiring in his personality was the fact that he was not only a man of action, not only an extremely sophisticated diplomat, but he was a man of culture. And that is probably what is today more lacking in statespersons and in high-ranking officers of international organizations like the UN, is that strong link to culture. Allow me I'm not able to say by heart the quotes, but allow me to read a few sentences that show how much he was a man of culture. First quote: when asked which book he would most like to have if stranded on a desert island, he replied Cervantes' Don Quixote, and preferably in an old French edition. Second, he called poetry, and I quote, a necessary and even indispensable complement to diplomacy. The diplomat, like the poet, works with words, transposes words, using them as a key, although not necessarily a master key. End of quote. And he also said he devoted at least 2 hours each day to what he called serious matters, by which he meant literature. And he said one of his constant challenges was maintaining a balance which we too easily lose without the firm hand and open eye of great art. And indeed, it is the fact that he was a man of culture that would allow him to have a universal view, a universal perspective, to consider diversity as a richness, to be able to understand the others, to promote tolerance, to promote dialogue, and to find solutions for the most difficult and intricate diplomatic problems of his time. This is what, indeed, is sometimes lacking today. And the proof that this translated into a vision of the world that is as actual today as it was during his life is very well represented in what he once said, and I will quote him again. Our world of today, we are, of course, very decades ago, is more than ever before one world. The weakness of one is the weakness of all, and the strength of one, not the military strength, but the real strength, the economic and social strength, the happiness of people, is indirectly the strength of all. Through various developments which are familiar to all, world solidarity has to say been forced upon us. This is no longer a choice of enlightened spirits. It's something which those whose temperament leads them in the direction of isolationism have also to accept. If yesterday when I met the press, I would have said these instead of the poor words I invented at the moment, I think I would have been perfectly actual and perfectly to the point. And this shows how vivid it is his memory, how actual it is his thinking, and how important it is his inspiration for what we can do today. And what we can do today is not easy. I remember when I became member of government, prime minister in Portugal, 20-something years ago, we were living in a period of enormous optimism in the world. The Cold War had ended. The globalization was seen by many not only as an immense source of prosperity for the world, but of prosperity that would be able to trickle down in order to benefit the whole of humankind and not just the richest ones. We had a clear moment in which the human rights agenda was gaining ground in relation to the national sovereignty agenda, and the idea that after the Cold War and after some dramatic problems that were faced in that decade, I mean the genocide in Rwanda, the problems in the Balkans, there was this idea that the new unipolar world would establish a new kind of democratic order that would prevail everywhere, the end of history, to remind us of the book of Fukuyama. Now, the truth is that that optimism was of short duration. First of all, if it is true that globalization has provided enormous benefits to humankind in wealth, in trade, in the increase of a huge middle class, in the increase of the time of life, in the reduction of absolute poverty, the truth is also that globalization has increased inequalities in a dramatic way. 8 persons, by the way, 8 men, in today's world own as much wealth as the poorest half of the global population. This shows the level of inequality we have reached. And at the same time, many are the losers of globalization in the rust belts of this world. And together with the increased insecurity, together with also the inability the international community has had to manage the problems of human mobility, this has progressively generated an environment in which the trust of people in relation to political establishments and the trust of people in relation to international organizations like the UN and to multilateralism is dramatically being reduced. And this is one of the great difficulties we face today. How to build trust enough to have an action that can be meaningful in the solution of the problems of our times. Because the problems of our times are global problems that can only be solved with global solutions, but there is a certain trend for the isolationism that was mentioned by Dag Hammarskjöld with all the consequences that we are witnessing today. And we need to be able to, again, with his ideals, with his values, put multilateralism in the center of our objectives to make sure that we are able to deal with the global problems that we are facing. And of course, the most dramatic of those problems are related to conflict. We have seen in the recent past not only an enormous difficulty in ending conflicts. Look at Afghanistan, look at Somalia, look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We are still there where it all started, when he was alive. Not only old conflicts seem never to die, but we have witnessed a multiplication of new conflicts, and conflicts becoming more and more interlinked, and more linked now to a new threat of global terrorism. We are always at terrorism, but this form of global terrorism that can strike anywhere, anytime, without us understanding why and for what reason, this new threat is clearly linked to this multiplication of conflicts and to the interconnections among those conflicts. If you look at the map from Nigeria to Mali, looking into Libya, into Somalia, then moving to Yemen, to Syria, to, of course, the Palestinian-Israel situation still unresolved, and then to Iraq, to Afghanistan, now, unfortunately, to Myanmar. All these conflicts are becoming, as I said, more and more interlinked and more linked to this new threat of global terrorism. And we are witnessing an enormous difficulty of the international community to address them, to find solutions for them. And that is why the prevention, the capacity to prevent conflicts, as was very central in Dag Hammarskjöld thinking, is today more important than ever, because we are facing an enormous difficulty in solving the conflicts that we are facing. Now, the truth is that if we look at this complex set of conflicts, the most dramatic group is in the Middle East. In the Middle East, we see the Palestinian-Israeli problem stuck. We don't see hope of any meaningful resumption of negotiations, serious negotiations in the short term. I'm a true believer that there is only one solution, there is no plan B. That solution is a two-state solution in which two peoples are able to live together, one and the other in security. But unfortunately, it doesn't look that we are moving in that direction, and we see the resumption of violence in the last few days in Gaza with dramatic consequences that it's still difficult to foresee as far as they can go. And we see the international community paralyzed and unable to address the problem, and the UN also without the power, without the capacity to really make things move. We see the worst humanitarian tragedy in today's world in Yemen, the difficulties we have to address the situation in Libya, the progress that has been made recently, and we need to recognize it, in Iraq. But then we come to the most dramatic of all situations, the situation in Syria. And when one looks at this Middle East, it is clear that we are witnessing several divides that are interconnected, that enhance each other and make it extremely difficult to find solutions or to even discover an entry point to be able to move positively in relation to these situations. First of all, we are witnessing the rebirth of the Cold War, but I would say with two fundamental differences. In the Cold War, the two superpowers were more or less able to control their clients, and the world was divided ideologically and politically between the two. Now, if one looks at Syria, you not only have two superpowers, but you have another group of countries that have an influence in the area, some of them sometimes with the capacity to be spoilers and without the superpowers' possibility to control them as in the past. And second, during the Cold War, there were mechanisms of dialogue, of control, in order to make sure that the risks that existed, the tensions that existed, would not spiral in a way that would lead to a nuclear war and create the end of our planet. And those mechanisms were in place, and those mechanisms have worked for decades. Today, those mechanisms are no longer in place. People forgot about the Cold War, but now the tension is growing, and we have seen in the recent days how dramatic it can be, but we do not have those mechanisms that guarantee that things do not get out of control. But then you have the Sunni-Shia divide. You had divides within the Sunni community for a number of reasons, namely the attitude in relation to the Muslim Brotherhood. You have the Turkish-Kurdish problem that is not solved, and on the contrary is getting worse and more dramatic in recent times. We have the situation of communities that in the Middle East are at risk. I always say, I worked a lot with the refugees from Iraq and Syria belonging to Christian communities, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans and others. And I always remind that when in my country people were still worshipping the trees and the rivers, those people in the Middle East were already discussing whether the Holy Ghost would come out of the Father or out of the Father and the Son, which proves that these communities, and we could go on with the Yazidis and many others, are part of the vital society structure of this region. And of course, their situation is today dramatically at risk. And it's another factor of instability that we cannot forget. So, with all these divides, we have sometimes an entry point to see how we can address the problem, and this is the reason why the Security Council has been largely paralyzed in relation to Syria, and I have to pay tribute to Sweden, that has been consistently trying to make bridges. But of course, you can only make a bridge between the two margins of a river if the margins themselves accept the bridge to be there. If the margins are not really interested in a bridge, it's very difficult to build that bridge. But I pay tribute to what has been the consistent effort of Swedish diplomacy in order to make the bridges that would allow us to find an entry point to address the tragic situation in Syria, in which we see not only the suffering of the Syrian people after 8 years gaining proportions that are unimaginable, with more than 5 million refugees, with levels of displacement and humanitarian needs that are unique in the world, but now more recently with the use of chemical weapons and the use of chemical weapons in total impunity and the inability of the international community to find the mechanisms of attribution and punishment that would be necessary in order to make sure that those weapons that have horrorized the world in the First World War and in the war between Iraq and Iran and in other moments, in other tragic moments of humankind, are back, and we are apparently unable to address this. So it is absolutely essential to have a surge in our diplomatic capacity to solve these conflicts, but I would say, and I would repeat it, more and more we need to understand how wise Dag Hammarskjöld was when he said prevention must be our key instrument. And today we say prevention and sustaining peace, because unfortunately when sometimes we are able to reach a settlement in a situation, we see how difficult it is to preserve the stability and the peace for the next period. But more recently, we also discovered that it's not only these kind of conflicts that are, in any case, except for the threat of terrorism localized, not only these kind of conflicts that are threatening us. We are back to a situation in which the nuclear problem is on the table. We have seen the North Korea, and we have seen how fortunately it was possible in relation to North Korea to apparently find a way to move in the right direction, but we are not yet there. We see the risks of the JCPOA. That was a very important diplomatic achievement of the international community in relation to the Iranian nuclear program. We see it at dramatic risk. And so, together with the proliferation of chemical weapons, we see a risk of a new surge of proliferation of nuclear weapons, because obviously if JCPOA fails and if Iran moves ahead with a nuclear program, there will be other countries trying to imitate, and if North Korea is not solved, we will see probably the end of a successful non-proliferation commitment of the international community that we had in the past few years. So a new level of threat that needs to be faced with total commitment from our side. But the threats that we face are not only related to conflict. I think that the defining element of our age, and probably the biggest threat for the future of our planet, is climate change. And there again, it's important to say that climate change is running faster than us. It's important to say that, first of all, the Paris Agreement commitments are not yet being made by all. And second, the commitments reached in Paris are not enough to address the threat of climate change. We have seen in the last forecasts presented by the different international organizations, the World Meteorological Organization and others, we see that we are reaching levels that create the risk to make irreversible, in 4 or 5 years, irreversible the impossibility to reach the Paris targets. Which means that we need an enhanced ambition in relation to the control of emissions, the reduction of emissions. And I'd like to say that Sweden has given a fantastic example with its program, and that we need all countries to show the same resolve. We need more ambition, and we need consistency in the implementation of that ambition in relation to the Paris commitments, and we need to make sure that we do not lose this race, because it would have devastating consequences for our planet. And what has happened in the last season of hurricanes in the Caribbean is a clear demonstration of the risks we are facing. Now, the truth is that, independently of many aspects of progress in many countries, independent of the fact that technology is today in our favor. Today, renewable energy is competitive, can be the cheapest available energy in any part of the world. The truth is that we see still many policies subsidizing fossil fuels and the building of infrastructures that are completely negative in relation to the climate change perspectives. We had last year, again, an increase of emissions of CO2 for the first time in the past few years, which means that things are not under control. And fossil fuels remain a serious problem, and I underline the Swedish compromise to get rid of the use of fossil fuels in a meaningful short period. Now, I have quoted, I must say, I don't know whom, that said something that I find a very good image, is that the Stone Age did not end for lack of stones. And so the age of fossil fuels should not end for lack of fossil fuels. We would need to be able to end the age of fossil fuels before, because that is the need of the humanity, and that is the need of an healthy planet. And we need to have an enhanced ambition in relation to climate change. And then, when one looks at what is our program for a fair globalization, the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the need to assume that agenda globally, it's also important to recognize that that agenda needs to be seen in the context of the most recent evolutions of science and technology. I believe that we are witnessing transformations that we are not able to entirely forecast. If you look at genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, the way the cyberspace today exists, the truth is that we are entering a new age people say, the fourth industrial revolution, and it is clear that we are not yet prepared for it. Governments are not taking it fully into account. International organizations are not able to deal with many of its aspects, and I think that a serious reflection must be made about the fourth industrial revolution, its enormous potential for the benefits of humankind, for the Agenda 2030 to be a reality, but also the risks we are facing at global level. I am convinced that we are witnessing today multiple episodes of cyber war between states. And I have no doubt that if there will be a new serious war between states, the war will be preceded by a massive cyber attack. I mean, in the First World War, before an offensive, there was usually a barrage of artillery. Then we have seen in recent wars that it was the Air Force and some cruise missiles that would start to undermine the defense of the other side. I believe that the next war, serious war, I'm not talking about those more localized regional conflicts, if it starts, it will start with a massive cyber attack. And I think we need to make an effort to make sure that what we had as a legal framework for war, the Geneva Conventions, I think it's absolutely essential to make sure that they apply to cyber war. And there is here a very important work to be done by the First Commission of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And I think we need to take this very seriously. But the problem is not only cyber war. If one looks at the cyberspace today, if one looks how it is a fantastic instrument for all of us, but also it is used by terrorist organizations and criminal gangs, it is clear that we need some kind of capacity to regulate the Internet of Things that today doesn't exist. I don't think that can be a traditional form of regulation. Those traditional mechanisms to have an international convention and then to apply that convention globally, it takes a lot of time. Things now run so quickly that this would not work. And this cannot also be a simple intergovernmental mechanism. And in some, let's be honest, some governments use also the internet to oppress their own citizens, as we know. So we need a multi-stakeholder approach to look into the creation of some protocols, of some guidelines, and some ways in which we can make sure that the cyberspace works in favor of us all and not as an instrument that puts in risk also our own civilization. And at the same time, if one looks at artificial intelligence, it is clear that there will be a huge impact in the labor markets, in the structure of our societies, and again, there is a strong appeal for us to be able to make an effort in order to make sure that this impact is, first of all, foreseen, and then that governments and international organizations are able to cooperate for, again, artificial intelligence to be a fantastic instrument to the benefits of the humankind and not a risk to the way our societies are organized. I do believe it is possible, but we will have a fourth industrial revolution that will be much quicker than the previous ones, with impacts that will be much more dramatic in the structure of societies, and the capacity to recycle people for new jobs will be much more limited, especially in the developing world. So again, there is a number of things that require a strong commitment of the international community, a strong international cooperation, the mobilization of government, civil society, and the academia and the private sector in order to be able to anticipate the fourth industrial revolution and to create the conditions for it to be a positive step in the evolution of our planet. And also addressing some of the ethical questions that this technological transformation is creating. Look at genetic engineering. Again, fantastic possibilities to benefit our health, fantastic possibilities for the development of our communities, but enormous threats that in bad hands can create monstrous things that we need to avoid at all costs. And these are things that need to be discussed more thoroughly and that require a stronger international commitment. Now, traditional forms of regulation do not apply, traditional forms of control do not apply, but I do believe there is an entry point for the UN, and that entry point is for the UN to be a platform where governments, the civil society, the academia, the private sector can come together and discuss how can we find ways to address these problems, how can we make sure that we transform this technological evolution into a positive contribution to the solution of our global problems. And one last word about human mobility. I've been for 10 years High Commissioner for Refugees. And I must confess that during the period in which I was High Commissioner for Refugees, refugee protection was more or less well respected around the world. Borders were essentially open. The case of refoulement, which means when someone is sent back to the country where that person can suffer persecution, were very limited. And refugee protection was granted, I would say, by the overwhelming majority of states in the world. Today we see that this is becoming a problem. We see that refugee protection is no longer guaranteed. We see many borders closed. We see situations of refoulement. And I think it's absolutely essential to re-establish the integrity of the refugee protection regime. And that is also linked to the way societies look at migration. I am a strong believer that migration is a positive contribution to the future of our planet. That is even a necessary element for the future of our planet. But if something is necessary, it is good that that thing is well organized. And the drama is that we have witnessed, both in relation to migration, but also in relation to refugee flows, a total disorganization in some parts of the world, and particularly in Europe. I remember when we had the massive outflow of Syrian refugees. It would be expected that Europe would come together. And we were talking about 1 million people that came into the European continent and into a union that has more than 500 million people, which means we are talking about 0.2% of the European population. In normal situations, in the context of European solidarity, if there will be a proper reception, beyond, of course, the need to work before in prevention, in support to the states of first asylum, but leaving that behind, considering only the impact of this flow, if this flow would have been organized with proper reception centers and with an equitable distribution of people among all European states, as many of us proposed at that time, this would not have been felt. My country would have received 20-something thousand Syrians. It would be easily absorbed. The fact is that there was no European approach, there was no European solidarity, and basically two countries, Sweden and Germany, have suffered most of the impact with total lack of solidarity of other European countries. We cannot deal with the problems of migration and refugees in the world without effective international cooperation to make sure that those things that can be a benefit for our societies are used in a way that do not undermine the well-being of people and do not undermine also the public opinion and the values that have been traditionally our values in this part of the world. When we see the development of forms of xenophobia, racism, of rejectionism, it is clear that to a large extent they came from the fact that there was not a proper international solidarity and a proper organization of things that, being to a certain extent inevitable and being also largely positive, if left in an uncoordinated and chaotic way, create enormous problems that generate enormous opposition in public opinions and make life difficult for all those that try to do the right thing in these circumstances. And my appeal is that, taking profit of the two negotiations that are now in place within the General Assembly of the United Nations, both in relation to migration and in relation to refugees, that it is possible to have a rational approach of international cooperation, making sure that these phenomena, that can be positive phenomena, are indeed well managed, and being well managed can serve the purpose of countries of origin, countries of transit, countries of destination, and can be to the benefit of us all. My country is, of course, much poorer than Sweden, but even my country, that had a difficult period in the last few years, could not survive today without migration. The Portuguese are not as consistent as the Swedes in making sure that our ethnic group is maintained. Our fertility index is about 1.3. I know Sweden is much closer to the 2 that are supposed to be the reference level. And so, without migration, Portugal cannot survive. I always tell the story of my mother. My mother is now 95 years old. There is permanently one person with her to help with some kind of care. I have never seen a Portuguese supporting her. And Portugal is not the richest country in Europe. So it's clear that we need migration. But if migration is not properly organized, it's clear that we will see the development of these forms of rejectionism that favor the emergence in our societies of all the evils of hate, of all the evils of rejection, of all the evils of xenophobia that we need to absolutely eliminate. And again, I have a huge debt of gratitude towards Sweden for the support that Sweden has always provided to, when I was High Commissioner for Refugees, to our programs, but the support Sweden is today providing to the United Nations. Sweden is a very important pillar of multilateralism in today's world. Sweden has been not only very active in our own bodies, and I mentioned the Security Council, the General Assembly, in the definition of policies, but Sweden has been supporting some of the most relevant programs, from development cooperation to humanitarian action to the combat against sexual exploitation and abuse or sexual harassment, different priorities of Swedish foreign policy that are absolutely crucial for the effectiveness of the United Nations, and then a very active engagement in mediation, a very active engagement in prevention and sustaining peace that are absolutely crucial for our work to be successful. So my last words are of profound gratitude to the Swedish government and the Swedish people for what has been your consistent commitment with multilateralism, your consistent commitment with international solidarity, and my appeal for Sweden to go on remaining that fundamental pillar for our common work, having as a key reference, both for your country and for the UN, as fundamental reference, I would say, the unique contribution that Dag Hammarskjöld has given to all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that was a really strong speech that we will all scrutinize closer, and we will have time for some questions. I think there are some microphones there, and some students are ready to ask questions. But I think maybe the best is if you come up with me here and we can respond from here. Because of course, as you come here, as the Vice Chancellor mentioned, you come from a beautiful place called Backåkra, which I think is the first time you come to that place. How was your experience there? And is there now a sort of a spirit of Backåkra in the UN Security Council?
I have to say that it is almost surreal, no? To come out of some meetings of the Security Council that were probably the most aggressive and difficult I have ever witnessed, and then to go to that paradise of serenity, of silence, and of beauty. I hope that this will be an inspiration for the members of the Security Council, but only the permanent representatives were there. It would be good if the presidents, the prime ministers and others would also be there to make sure that there will be some important changes in the policies of a number of states that have, I would say, some responsibility in making sure that we move in the right direction in relation to peace and global security.
So you suggest that we develop the back-okra format?
I think you should invite a few more people.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now let me see, where are the microphones? There. And the first question is to one of the students from the Utrikespolitiska föreningen. Who is there? Who is the closest one? Please identify yourself and your question.
Yes, dear Secretary General, thank you for this lecture. My name is Ulrika, and I am speaking on behalf of the Uppsala Association of Foreign Affairs. And we would like to ask you, what do you consider to be the best course of action for the United Nations and the international community in responding to the persecution of the Rohingya in Myanmar? Thank you.
Well, what we are witnessing in Myanmar is a tragedy. I think that the adequate qualification is a massive ethnic cleansing done to a group, the Rohingyas, that practically were removed from all the areas of North Rakhine State where they were a majority. They still remain in the areas where they were a minority in relation to the Rakhine population. And this is, of course, this was accompanied by a level of brutality and the most dramatic violations of human rights that you can imagine, and the number of people killed, raped, etc. was terrible. But this is the climax of what has been, and I was there several times in my past capacity in North Rakhine State, what has been probably the worst case of discrimination of an ethnic community within a state. The Rohingya were not granted citizenship. They were considered not to be citizens of Myanmar. They were considered to be illegal migrants. The drama is that if you go to Bangladesh, they are also considered to be illegal migrants. So, it's the most tragic situation of them all. You have no country that you can call yours. They couldn't move from their villages without permission. They lived in extreme poverty. They would need permission to marry. They were subject to all forms of harassment, which are obvious. When you are so restricted, it's very easy for especially corrupt police forces and others to harass you in the worst possible ways. The argument that I heard several times was, they are not ours. I even heard once, they are ugly, and so they should leave. So this is deeply rooted in the mentality of the majority of the population in Myanmar. And what I think that has happened is that, with the pretext of an attack to a military installation, I believe the military decided to conduct this kind of operation that, to a certain extent, was for people in command a win-win strategy, because they would be popular for the majority of the population that has been also systematically under the pressure of some Buddhist fundamentalists, namely monks. I must confess, this was one of the biggest surprises of my life. I thought that fundamentalism could exist in Christianity, in Islam, in Hinduism, in Judaism, but not in Buddhism, that I thought was a kind of religion that would not allow for fundamentalism. But no, there is a Buddhist fundamentalism with incitement of hatred against this Muslim population. And as I said, it was a win-win situation, because on one way the military would be popular with the population. On the other way, Aung San Suu Kyi would become vulnerable, because obviously much of her reputation within the international community was severely put into question with what has happened, without her being able to address this challenge. So what is the entry point for the UN? I mean, the different UN human rights bodies have been quite active on this, denouncing this. We have had, I wrote to the Security Council a letter, official letter, asking for this to be in the agenda of the Security Council and to be addressed. The Security Council has been addressing this. Again, there is no unity in the Security Council on this issue. And some countries are very keen on the so-called, and this is the drama that we are seeing, is that more and more national sovereignty is invoked not to allow the international community to be active when basic human rights are violated in such a systematic way. I'm now appointing a new envoy that will try to act positively. There are some small indicators of improvement. I think that the pressure, some sanctions that were made by some governments are leading the government to say that they want returns. They even signed an agreement with Bangladesh, but of course return in safety and dignity and voluntarily can only be possible with a massive investment in the reconstruction and a massive investment in the reconciliation of communities, and we are not yet there. So there is still a long way to go. In between, we have a huge population of Rohingyas in Bangladesh. The monsoons are coming. Many of them are still in areas that are prone to very dangerous movements of land. And so we are in the middle of a nightmare. I think we are doing an enormous work in relation to humanitarian relief for the Rohingya refugee population. We have been putting as much pressure as we can in relation to the government and the military in Myanmar and asking countries to do it. And some countries have done remarkably on this. Indonesia, for instance, has been extremely active in relation to create the conditions to change things. But I'm not yet optimistic. I think that we are still facing an environment in which it is very difficult for Myanmar to fully assume its responsibilities. The interesting thing is that some months before, I had come to an agreement with Aung San Suu Kyi on the way to go. And that agreement was that a verification exercise that the government of Myanmar would conduct, even if there were problems in the way it was being put in place, would lead for nationality to be granted to those that, according to the Myanmarese law, that is not good, that we do not agree with, but those that were supposed to be granted that nationality would be granted nationality, and to the others, even if in our opinion they also should be granted nationality, to the others should be granted a legal status, like legal migrants, allowing them to have residence, to move, to buy things, to have access to education, health, and things of the sort. And there was an agreement on that. But unfortunately, then things got out of control in the way that you have seen. It is one of the major tragedies of today's times. And again, we do not have today the international instruments to deal with a situation like this. You talked about East Timor. In East Timor, we had nothing similar. But at a certain moment, in East Timor, I'm sorry, I'm talking probably too much, but I think this is
valuable for us to hear.
Very important. In East Timor, there was, after the referendum, in which that was organized by Indonesia, according to the agreements that were made, a referendum on independence or integration in Indonesia, the population voted massively, 90-something% for independence. But that triggered a reaction of some pro-Indonesian militias, and eventually the army was also not able to control the situation, and there was an effective risk of a massacre in East Timor. And at that time, I remember the problem was to convince the President of the United States that something had to be done. The moment the President of the United States agreed that something had to be done, immediately, the Security Council met and approved. Indonesia accepted, and there was a force led by Australia that went to East Timor to guarantee that that massacre would not take place. If that situation would occur today, I doubt that what has happened in that time when I was in government and very committed to it, I doubt it would be possible today. Probably today, East Timor would not have found the solution that was found, thanks to the capacity of the international community to be active in this situation and the union of the Security Council in this situation. Unfortunately, that union is not there when we think about Myanmar.
Thank you very much. That was a very useful analysis of this problem, and you really showed that you have the different nuances of this, so appreciate that very much. We have time for one more question from Pax et Bellum, Student Association Pax et Bellum. You have a question?
Hi, dear Mr. Secretary General, thank you for your lecture. My name is Josephine van Zanten from Pax and Bellum. You touched upon many issues during the lecture that still need improvement, and knowing that we have many students in this hall that are very committed to work on these issues, what would your advice be for us?
I mean, do everything you can. First, you are citizens of your country. As citizen of your country, it's very important that you make sure that Sweden remains a very strong pillar of multilateralism and a very strong pillar of the solution of these global problems. Second, you can today, with access to social media, do a lot of awareness and mobilization in Sweden and everywhere else in the world in relation to the causes we are talking about. Climate change, for instance, is an example. A lot of work needs to be done to make people being conscious of how dangerous the situation is already today. You can engage directly in different areas of activity. I mean, you can be a volunteer in some kind of activity in some moment, somewhere. There is in your civil society a vibrant number of organizations that are very active in different parts of the world. You can organize yourselves into campaigns, into all kinds of things. I mean, today, fortunately, we have instruments of communication that allow us to exercise our citizenship in a much more effective way than when I had your age and when it was much more difficult to become universalists in what we do.
We have a question also from the UPAD. Where is the student? There, please. And that will be the last question.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for an interesting and inspiring lecture. Since we're seeing, unfortunately, a development of populist rhetoric and polarization amongst groups in societies, not only in Europe, but also throughout the world, our question is as follows. What role does the UN play in facilitating an inclusive dialogue concerning international solidarity? Thank you.
Well, that's what we try to do every day. But I think that we have been very engaged. I mean, there are different fronts. But in the front of peace and security, we have been very engaged in relation to try to mediate several of the potential crisis situations and very engaged in trying to address the conflicts that are still taking place. Just to give an example, we are making a huge effort in Libya to make sure that we have a roadmap and to make sure that the roadmap is implemented and we are able to reach a political agreement in Libya. We are trying now hard in Yemen to try to make things back into a track of a political serious discussion. We are not yet there, and we can go on and on with the examples of this kind. In Africa, we are cooperating very actively with the African Union and sub-regional organizations. I will be visiting, for instance, the Democratic Republic of Congo, so central in Dag Hammarskjöld's work and, unfortunately, death, to go together with the head of the African Union to Kinshasa to make sure that elections take place. So, I mean, we are very active for the promotion of dialogue and for the finding of solutions, but there is one problem. You cannot convince people to dialogue if their strategy is not to dialogue. And that, unfortunately, still exists in many parts of the world. I do not believe in military solution for any of the conflicts we have today. I believe that we need political solutions for all of them. But unfortunately, in many situations, I think people are still thinking they can win the wars. And even if they can, some wars can be won, but the consequences of that victory could be the discrimination in relation to large parts of the population and the emergence of forms of terrorist activity that would then spread not only within the country but to other parts of the world. So it's better to have political solutions, but unfortunately we still have those that believe they can win wars. And we spoke of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I would like to tell you that I take very seriously the fact that it's not yet clarified the reason why Dag Hammarskjöld died. I have renewed the mandate of Chief Justice Othman, and I want to make here a very strong appeal to all countries whose archives are very important for clarification of the truth, to all countries to fully cooperate with him in order to make sure that once and for all we are able to discover the true reason why Dag Hammarskjöld had unfortunately to sacrifice his life in the line of duty.
Thank you very much, not least for taking up this particular issue, because it was not only Dag Hammarskjöld that died, there was quite a number of other Swedish airmen, and in Swedish history it remains a trauma. So I appreciate really that you take up that. And thank you for your very extensive, very thoughtful reflections. And I hope we all can feel a little more safer when we wake up tomorrow morning knowing that you are the Secretary General. So thank you for being here.
Not me.
Your Royal Highness, Secretary General, Mr. Speaker, Ministers, Excellencies, Mr. County Governor, Vice Chancellor, colleagues and students, ladies and gentlemen. Your Excellency, Secretary General António Guterres, you are the 19th in line to have delivered the Dag Hammarskjöld Lecture at the Uppsala University, and the third Secretary General to do so. It's an honor for the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and to the university, and we thank you and congratulate you. His Excellency, Secretary General António Guterres, was chosen by the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and Uppsala University to deliver the 2018 Dag Hammarskjöld Lecture for his long-standing commitment to the values of the United Nations and to the organization. The multitude of global challenges, such as sustaining peace, ensuring sustainable development, and addressing climate change and migration, cannot be effectively addressed by any single country or coalition. Notwithstanding, there is an alarming evidence that mounting nationalism, protectionism, and populism is leading to skepticism towards existing multilateral arrangements. This contributes to unilateral or bilateral action where international norms are increasingly both ignored and eroded. Renewed efforts are therefore needed to sustain and advance multilateral solutions and institutions, particularly the United Nations. This calls for courage, integrity, and resolute leadership of the United Nations, qualities that we have already seen from the current Secretary General. As High Commissioner for Refugees, determined action and diplomatic skills, António Guterres worked effectively for the promotion or protection of the most vulnerable. He displayed courage and leadership in managing the UNHCR, both in its mandate and in its administration, initiating and implementing operational change and decentralizing operations. As Secretary General, António Guterres has laid down a bold vision for a strengthened UN that demands resourcefulness and accountability. It prioritizes the advancement of the development system and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, the progression of sustaining peace, and the strengthening of the leadership and management of the organization. Your Excellency, we look forward to supporting you in this work. And the Dag Hammarskjöld, as a Dag Hammarskjöld Lecture, you're also invited to join the International Honorary Committee of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, where leaders in your field can gather to both reflect and drive debate and progress on global challenges and solutions. The university has instituted a special medal which is only bestowed upon the Dag Hammarskjöld Lectures. The medal has been created by the artist Annette Rydström, and it's cast in bronze. Its obverse shows a portrait of Dag Hammarskjöld, and the reverse shows a handshake, the old symbol of Concordia, representing Hammarskjöld's legacy in diplomacy. In Latin inscription, the University of Uppsala dedicates the medal in memory to his outstanding achievements. Your Excellency, I now invite you to receive the 19th medal with your name engraved on it from the Vice Chancellor.